Okay, live to Tunisia.
Yeah.
Yeah, Abel Ashes. Hello, sir. It might be a bit distorted. Do apologise about the sound quality from my end, anyway. Abel's absolutely fine. So I'm going to hand over to you to talk about your song, your projects.
Okay. Well, I'm used to having these disruptive audio. I having spent years in a long distance relationship with a woman here in Tunisia while I'm in the United States on Skype. It was many interrupted phone calls in the period right when the revolution happened here in Tunisia in 2000. Well, 2011, 2012 was the beginning of our relationship. Um,
Wow.
so yeah,
And
it brings back memories having choppy video conversations online.
it is a bit choppy. What is the lockdown like over
Um, well, for me, I didn't really experience a lot of a difference in my own personal life because uh, coming here after my wife was in a car accident in which she was made paraplegic by a reckless driver that hit her. Her and her sister were in the car and they were hit from behind and had to leave everything behind in the U.S. Yeah, I was living in New Mexico where I grew up, driving a concrete mixer, and we were planning on leaving and going to either the East Coast or the West Coast right before this happened. She lost her
right?
residency and so on. So when I came here, you know, I've been kind of housebound, assisting her. So I was already in a confinement, for about 2.5 years when this all
Yeah.
started, and so not a big difference for me, but except for the worry about bringing the virus home. I don't go out very often, right? The other day I just went to a grocery store and I walked past a cafe here and just packed with people, no masks, everybody's smoking inside, outside, uh, even the employees. I see the cooks come out from the back and uh, just as though nothing is happening. So
Mm,
it's a bit
sounds
disturbing.
bad. Yeah, but you're using it quite productively though, with your songs and your writing and your production of putting your songs out there as well.
Yeah, right before this accident happened to my wife, um, uh, I had just decided to get back into making music. I had spent about a decade and a half not really making any new music. I made my first album in 2001, and it was sort of it's been compared a lot to early Frank Zappa, the Mothers, Captain Beefheart, Sonny Chirac. These are usually the references that people compare it to. It was called Eat Plastic, with a great drummer named Marcos Fernandez from the Tremor Floor Collective in San Diego. He now lives back home where he grew up in Yokohama, Japan. And my brother-in-law playing bass on a couple of tracks, and a guy named Fade Ogalon, who he works up in San Jose now. I haven't seen him in years. One of my close friends. He happened to also be from New Mexico, but we didn't know each other from New Mexico. And so, when I did that album and then did a couple other projects with a guitar player named Eric Hinsel, kind of a free improvisational project we did for years, and we put out a little EP of some of that stuff. And solo album I did called Other Elements. And then I sort of just gave up on music for a long, long time. I was more involved with political activism and just earning a living, and kind of put it to the side. And I think maybe perfectionism was the problem. And I've learned that perfectionism, getting that out of the way and saying, I'm just going to do it anyway, even though I don't have money, I don't have a recording budget. I'm going to go for it and do what I can do with what I have. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that the Frank Zappa influence was a part of that brought me to that point of understanding that, because I realized that what he did through his whole career was he crafted his compositions to whichever musicians he had available to work with. If he had, Flo and Eddie from the Turtles in the group, he put a lot of vocal parts in the music. If he had, a fantastic drummer, he did intricate drum parts, like with Terry Bozzio or something. So I decided, if all I have is an acoustic guitar or an electric guitar, and I have no musicians to work with, I have very little time to work on anything. I do it at my own pace. I do what I can do with what I have, and later, when circumstances allow, I can bring other musicians in. I can do something with a bigger budget. So I just went for it because I'm very creative and I come up with a lot of material pretty quickly when I allow myself to I'm not censoring myself with that perfectionist nonsense, right? So I started writing songs about what was going on during the period that we had coming out of the recession, in the period when we had the Occupy Wall Street movement going on. And I was driving a concrete mixer in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where I grew up. You just had another guy you interviewed here, James Effington. And I've actually been in a restaurant 2 times when he was performing. I don't know the guy, but so just a funny coincidence that you just started doing this interview series recently. We've only done a few, and another guy from Alamogordo was on one of them. I started writing new music, and then this accident happened, and I was supposed to be making an album when my wife was away and had this horrible carpal tunnel problem from breaking concrete off the outside of the concrete drum when we were slow, didn't have a lot of business, that just banging on it with a hammer and chisel for 10 hours a day or whatever. And so when I got here, I found that it was this strange sort of being on call all the time when you're a caregiver rather, for someone who's just become handicapped. So it was a funny thing where I had free time, but I could be interrupted at any time. So it was okay for writing, but it wasn't really good for recording. So I did a lot of writing before I recorded, and I had no opportunity to play with other musicians or teach anyone my songs or do any elaborate production. So it just turned into just get the guitar down, get the vocal down, and I wound up doing a whole project of all instrumental music, just solo guitar instrumentals, and another project is sort of protest songs, because it's sort of the two sides of my brain. I'm always, and I say protest songs, but it's a little bit different than that. There may be more about history, and current events in more of a. Sometimes I think, I'm certainly expressing opinions in them, and sometimes opinions with a lot of obscenities and so on, because I come from a blue collar background. But I like to think I'm trying to employ plenty of caveats in some of the things that I'm presenting, because I don't like the way that sometimes arguments go on forever because people don't get down to the facts of what they're discussing, and it stays to these sort of polarized opinions without enough fact to sort of go, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from, even though I don't agree with you. So I try to get a lot of factual details. So there's a lot of sort of science in the lyrics, as someone might say, rewriting and rewriting these lyrics. There's a poem at the end of the album I made last year called "Between the Droughts and the Floods" that is the closing piece on there. That it was essentially my attempt at putting in the form of a poem the whole history of the atomic bomb, why it was actually created, and why it was actually dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a more historically accurate picture, because it's a very complex issue. So, in terms of the fact that essentially, the mutually assured destruction phenomenon, I won't go too much into all the details, but it's a really interesting piece that I did. So I did an instrumental album, The Future's as Bright as a Dying Star. And my wife's favorite piece is on there. It's called Danza de los Trabajadores Cansados, which is Spanish for the dance of the tired workers. And she's always asking me to perform this piece. and then so I did these projects, and then I started going through the old archives and found a lot of live recordings that I'd done with my old band Abel Ashes and the Runs back in San Diego, the more Zappa-esque group. And then this year I wrote a few new songs and did some new arrangements of some old songs. And I did a song about this whole pandemic issue, and essentially coming from the perspective of being, I don't want to say shocked, because I'm not surprised by human ignorance, as somebody who looks at a lot of history, very interested in history. We're always doing stupid things, but let's say disappointed to see this expression when people said, I can't believe this is happening, in terms of a pandemic, a viral pandemic. And so this song, New Calamity, came from the idea that, we just had the SARS. We had the SARS epidemic. We had the MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is, if this virus were as deadly as MERS, we would be in enormous trouble. It's the problem with this virus is how contagious it is, and this new strain you have in Britain now apparently is more contagious. We don't know necessarily if it's more dangerous or less dangerous, but more contagious. But just the idea of pandemics have happened over and over throughout history, and it's a bit shocking, not shocking, as I said, a bit disappointing to hear even people that are supposed to be our leaders saying no one could imagine that this could ever happen. And so that was the idea of the song. Like, listen to the experts, listen to science, listen to doctors, listen to the epidemiologists, listen to historians. We've had pandemics throughout history. We have other things going on that there is an epidemic of people all over the world thinking they know more than the experts do, and not deferring to people who've spent their whole life studying a certain thing and saying, maybe they know something, maybe I should listen to them, So that's kind of what that song was, where it came from in terms of the lyrics.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen that on YouTube, The New Calamity.
I filmed the music video at a town called Jebel West out here, and I pronounce it wrong. My wife makes fun of me all the time for the way I pronounce it. But my Tunisian Arabic is better than my French, I've got to say. The French pronunciation is really horrendous. There's a physiotherapy center there, so she goes there frequently, and there's Roman aqueducts that run through, that you see in the music video, that sort of collide together. So I did that there, and I can hear in the middle of the piece how I like to do music that sort of has a lot of tempo changes, time signature changes, key changes. I don't always do that. I've got some very simple songs as well that are just 3-4 chord, songs. But
simple stuff does work, though, doesn't it? The simple chords, it's effective.
Yeah, absolutely. It all depends on what the intention of the piece is, I think. The easiest thing for me to write, that comes the most naturally to me, is instrumental music that's a bit convoluted and complex, but with no vocal. When I'm adding the vocal to it, I always have this problem that I really want to say something meaningful, and I want it to be poetic. I don't want it to be just a statement, but I also want it to be factually accurate. And so it becomes a really big chore writing lyrics for me usually. And when I do instrumental music, it's just about, does it move me? Does this sound move me? And sometimes there's a sort of you're going to a theory book, and you're pulling out some scales and chord progressions, and you're piecing something together that way. But sometimes it just comes from jamming, and you hit on something that sounds good and you go with it. But But yeah, instrumentals are much easier for me than the pieces with words. And sometimes the pieces with words, what does work best, because you are trying to say something and you want the emotions to come across, is a simpler chord progression, because the emotion, you're not trying to emotionally compete with all these other sounds, you know? So yeah, that worked quite well for some other pieces that were on some of the recent projects. There's a song that I did that's very autobiographical, which I didn't think I would write those type of songs years ago when I was making music. Um, and discusses my wife's accident, discusses uh, my somewhat abusive childhood, discusses
Okay.
and then it goes into something bigger. It's a song called R2P Human Refugees, and it's on actually two. I did two different versions of it because I ended up adding an instrumental bridge to it, and so I wanted to do a new version of it. Um, but basically, the idea is looking at my own life and the struggles that I've gone through of being an intellectual person that couldn't afford to stay in school, and being in university three different times and having to drop out for the sake of keeping my job and keeping a roof over my head, and
Mm.
going through violence in my childhood, and going through being sort of a social outcast and many times on the verge of homelessness and so on. And this is a guy who been, I've never been an alcoholic. I've never been a drug addict. I have no interest in those things. I'm very responsible. I've always worked. Uh, I work any job I can acquire. I don't say, oh, this job is not for me. I'm an artist. No, I've been a truck driver. I drove all over the United States. It was miserable. I've done all kinds of things: construction, farm work, factory work, etc. And 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 if I could end up on the verge of homelessness, it can happen to anybody, because
Yeah.
you're working that hard, you should be paid decently. So the idea behind the song was looking at these people who are struggling to make a better life, whether they're fleeing from the war in Syria, or they're fleeing from their kids being forcibly um, uh, forced into joining MS-13 in El Salvador, or they're fleeing from the war right next door here in Libya,
Okay.
and they they're being exploited by traffickers, and but when you're looking at a situation of people that are struggling to basically survive or make a better life for their kids. That's not all the people, of course, that are migrating, but it's a good percent of them. I see myself in them. So that was the idea, was to tell my story and to say, you know, when you're hating on these human refugees, you're hating on my human family, because the idea was that I see in them what I've gone through. I can put myself in that place. Even though maybe what I've gone through isn't as bad as what they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
I look at it and what they're going through is even worse. So I've got all this empathy for them, and I because of that song, I've come in contact with quite a few people that I might not have met otherwise, or not necessarily met in person. Some, Kurdish refugees in Greece and so on. But I've long been involved with helping uh, uh, secular refugees from theocracies and so on to acquire safe passage to countries where they're free to not be indoctrinated into a religion that they don't necessarily believe in. So
But it's
from that
great when you
standpoint.
can put your feelings into a song and onto paper.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and in that song, like we were talking about, what worked in that song was to just keep it to four simple chords through the whole song, but
Yeah.
chords that had the right emotion in them, that kind of gave you that my uh, I suppose the sort of feeling that you get when you listen to oh, I don't know, that some of the songs by artists like uh, some of the like U2 things from the 80s or some or you know, Watermelon and Easter Hay by Frank Zappa. You get that very sort of melancholy feeling, but at the same time, this sort of feeling of something positive coming out of something very, very negative, you know? And that's
Mm.
what I was kind of going for with the sound of it. And it just seemed to work to keep it as simple as possible on that one. So
That's really great. And Abel, I do thank you for talking for all this with the audio have been absolutely rubbish.
oh yeah, no problem at all. No problem at
Thank
all.
you.
So
And I do wish you well in everything that you do, all your projects. I hope they get out there, and I hope it does well for you. Keep writing, keep rocking, man.
same to you. And I
Yeah,
hope your all your employment and so on is not too much disrupted by the pandemic as well, because a lot of people
well,
going through that.
I haven't worked since March. I was a radio presenter before this, before I undertook these online interviews. I was a radio presenter, and then the lockdown happened. I had my son was born. He's now 5 months old, and
Congratulations.
yeah, and now to support artists, this is what I do for you. This is what I do for them.
Well, it's fantastic. And I look forward to listening to some of the other interviews that you've done and some in the future as well.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much, Abel. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Grant.
No worries. Catch you later.